We're doing a teaching on the calendar, building the calendar. Last week was part 1. I know we didn't get all of that on video, something technical issue or something, so we'll go back another time and try to redo that first part. But when I was thinking about doing this teaching, it was basically I was going to take every calendar that is in the Messianic movement right now and break it down, and then show how that calendar lined up with Scripture or misaligned itself with Scripture. And in praying about that, the Father spoke, well, I say he spoke to me in James, but he just puts things in my heart. And it basically came to my mind, well, how did you learn how to understand the calendar? Well, I started from the beginning. Then that same feeling came in my heart again. Well, how do you think they should learn the calendar? Well, they need to start at the beginning. So last week we started at the beginning of calendars. I mean, back before there ever was a written calendar, we had things in stones. We had stones that were placed that we saw last week that marked the movement in the sky and the stars. We have cuneiform tablets. We have all kinds of different things. So this week we're going to go over a few calendars. Now I want you to understand, although I am teaching you something really in depth about the calendar, even with that said, we could spend 2 or 3 weeks on each one of these calendars. Okay? I don't want to do that. I think I'm going to give you a quick rundown of where that calendar originated, how it came about, trying to correlate that back to Scripture, and then we're going to move on from that calendar, because you don't need to know the minutia of it. You can go back on your own and do that study. I'm going to just give you the highlights of it. With that being said, I want you to understand that each one of these steps in these calendars is a progression that brought us to where we are. And as we stated clearly and openly last week, every one of these calendars are based on man's calculations. Do we rely on man's calculations as believers? No, we rely on the Father, right? So last week we talked about Scripture, where He's the one that hung the sun, the moon, and the stars. He established them to be our moed. So He's in charge of time. It's something that we don't have the ability to take away from Him. So we have to rely on His reckoning of time. Now, sin entered into the world, and when sin entered into the world, we forgot our Elohim. We forgot His statutes. We forgot His ways. So we had to navigate this world that He put in perfect order to try to make sense out of it. So men started making calendars at that point. And normally, they saw how blessed the children of Israel were. So when they saw how blessed the children of Israel were, with crops, with animals, with all of the things that sustained life during that day and time, they began to watch how they observed the calendar. Well, of course, we're still trying to follow the Father's Moedim, His appointed times. So most calendars that you see, they're going to either be based off of a solar calendar or a lunar calendar. Some of them are what we call a lunar or a solar lunar calendar, or a lunisolar calendar, however you want to phrase it. But they all have that common thing in that the sun marks one reckoning of time and the moon marks another reckoning of time. Now last week we talked about how this one full revolution of the earth around the sun is a year. So we can't just discard the sun. We also talked about how every time we see that first sliver, in the month, it brings about a new month, a new moon, and so we can't disregard the moon. So a lunar solar calendar, but there's one element missing for the Father's reckoning of time, because He said, "Let it be, my words, let it be manifest here on the earth to mirror what is going on in the heavens." Okay. So when He established this, He established a calendar for what? For agriculture, right? So we have to rely on all three: agricultural, sun, and moon. That's the scheme of things. So as we look at these ancient calendars, let's see if we can pick out some things and see where maybe these ancient societies drew from to get these things. So the first calendar we're going to talk about is the calendar we left off with last week, the Sumerian calendar. Now most calendars, in fact, I'm not going to say most, I'm going to say every calendar that we know today has its origins in the Sumerian calendar. The Sumerian calendar is our oldest dated calendar that we have on record. We showed a picture of it last week, we'll show another picture of it today. But understanding that, do we follow a Sumerian calendar? Of course not. We're not Sumerians, right? So we saw that there were some problems with the Sumerian calendar. Oh, let's go back. The Sumerian calendar were among the first astronomers mapping the stars to set into sets of constellations, many of which survived in the zodiac and were also recognized by ancient Greeks. They were also aware of the 5 planets that are visible to the naked eye. So when we look at that disc that we call the Sumerian calendar, we can see that they're pointing out the movement of the planets, they're pointing out the movement of the stars, but did we establish a calendar off the movement of stars and planets? No, that's not what he said. He said he gave us the sun to rule over the day and the moon to rule over the night, right? And then he takes a pause there and it says, and he made the stars also. So the reason that we stated last week that they cannot correctly, because we did the math last week, if everybody remembers. We broke a day down to the second, to the millisecond. We broke an hour down, a minute down. We broke all of that down to the milliseconds last week and showed that, yeah, we can calculate those things, but there's one aspect of that we can't calculate, and it's a solar year. We do not have the ability to properly mathematically calculate a solar year. It's just a good guesstimation. I mean, we can get within seconds of it, but the reason we can't is because as we rotate the Earth, the stars rotate as well. So we can't correctly determine whether we've made an exact full revolution of the sun by calculating it off the stars, because to calculate anything you need a fixed reference point, right? So you need a fixed reference point here, you need a fixed reference point here, and those fixed reference points are the constellations in the sky. So when that constellation, when the star in that constellation, say we had a sundial here, when those constellations move back around and that star in that constellation hits the exact same point on that sundial, that would be a full solar revolution, right? It's what we would think, but it's actually not, because the stars move as well as the Earth's moving. So that's why there can't be a genuine calculation of it. Now the Sumerian calendar, they got pretty close, but the Sumerian calendar was based on 12 months. I'm telling you, a lot of this might be boring to you, but if you want to understand Yahweh's calendar, you need to know the history of how those calendars came about. So, although this might seem like minutia, and it is minutia, because I can explain Yahweh's calendar to you in about 15 minutes and we would be good. But me doing that, somebody else is going to come along and they're going to explain somebody else's calendar to you, whether it be the Enochian calendar, whether it be the full moon calendar, whether it be the first sliver calendar or the conjunction calendar. I mean, there's so many calendars floating around right now, and every one of them have facts that they use biblical reference for to try to prove that calendar right. Well, we can't all be right. How many has watched Fiddler on the Roof? And remember the scene where Tavia's sitting there and the guy's, well, he's right. And then this guy says something else and he goes, well, you're right also. And another guy says, well, they can't all be right, can they? Finally, the last one, they can't all be right. And he goes, well, you're right also. So we can't all be right. So we have to rely on Scripture alone. Hence the name of this ministry, Awaken to Torah. Because everything we do, we want to be able to establish in the Torah alone. We don't want to look at man's teaching. We don't want to look at man's calculations. We want to look at the Torah alone. With that said, however, we need to understand where this stuff comes from, how it originated, how it seeped into even those who are claiming to walk in Torah's life. This is a picture of the Samaritan calendar. Can anybody read ancient Samaritan? I can't either. So but evidently, those people who are smart enough to read this say that this calculates all the movement of the stars, all the movement of the planets, breaks the calendar up into 12 equal months of 30 days. Well, 12 times 30 is how many? 360. So, 360 days in a calendar. How many days is a solar calendar? 365, right? So every year their calendar's sliding on them because they were relying on man's calculations. So the reason they established calendars is because they had walked away from Yahweh, and the only reason to establish a calendar back in that day and time was for what? Crops, right? Because you need to know when, it's Farmer's Almanac, you need to know when to get your seed in the ground, you need to know when to harvest it. You need to know all of those things, and because they weren't relying solely on Yahweh, they needed man's calculations to get them close to when they needed to plant the seed, to get them close to when they needed to harvest, to get them close so they could celebrate their pagan festivals throughout the year, because all of the pagan festivals was based on some deity from some constellation or some movement of the moon or some movement of the sun. So they needed a close guesstimation to those things, and this Samaritan calendar was their first attempt, or the first known attempt that we know, other than the glyphs and the monoliths that they put out in the, like Stonehenge and different things that they used to calculate the movement of the sun, the movement of the stars. So a calendar and the system of irrigation. The Sumerian calendar and the Sumerian system of irrigation were both connected by one thing: farming. Both these inventions made farming easier for the Sumerians. Now last week we talked about the time period ending of the hunter and gatherer to now we're working the field with plows and horses and teams and plowing gardens and growing crops and that kind of thing. So the Sumerians needed to know when and what time of the year to do that. But in ancient Samaria, how many's ever been to the Middle East? There's not a whole lot of greenery there, is there? A lot of sand, unless you're in Israel. If you're in Israel, I mean, they've basically got that land green and lush now. But if you go outside of Israel, it's sand, desert wasteland. Ancient Sumer was the very first civilization to invent a calendar. The process went something like this. First, the Sumerian astronomers tracked the movement of the stars, planets, and the moon. Based on their observations, they invented a calendar which had 12 months, and each month had around 30 days. Therefore, altogether, 12 months had 360 days. This was the first concept of a year, months, and days. Now, if you look at this here, it kind of looks like that same Samaritan calendar, right? But it's not. This is the irrigation calendar, because they needed to know when the rains were coming. There's basically 3 civilizations at this time that is living off of a man-made calendar. So this thing right here, it's ancient Sumerian, but this isn't their calendar. This is when the rain's going to come, because there's not a lot of water there. They had to wait for the Euphrates and the Tigris to fill up so they could open up their aqueducts to get water out to their crops so they could grow their crops. So this is their first attempt at that. The days of the month would start and end at sunset. Each day had 12 hours, 6 hours of daylight and 6 hours of night. However, this calendar was not always completely accurate, and every 4 years or so, the Sumerians inserted an extra month into the calendar. How many people have ever studied out Hillel 2 calendar? Okay, So Hillel 2 is basically the calendar that we as Jewish people are on today. And every so often on that calendar, whether it be 3 years, 4 years, on the Hillel 2 it basically works out to every 4 years. You insert an additional month. We call it an Adar Bet. So because the 12th month on Hillel's calendar is called Adar, the month of Adar. So an Adar Bet means the second month of Adar. So we have 2 final months. That's basically where Hillel drew from, was the Samaritans had realized that their calendar was sliding. So would Hillel 2's calendar. Hillel, we're going to get into that, so I don't want to go real deep into it. But basically, Hillel understood that they were losing Jerusalem. They were fixing to lose the land and be dispersed as a people, and he wanted a way that all the people could still celebrate the feast together. So this is the Jewish attempt. Hillel 2's calendar is the Jewish attempt at the same thing the Samaritans did, trying to keep uniformity. The Sumerians also invented a zodiac based on the different phases of the moon, which started different agricultural phases in the year. This also helped the Sumerians know when floods are coming so they can be prepared. Now, this is a different calendar as well, carved on a stone. Everybody see the writing and all that? I can't read Samaritan writing. But basically it shows you frogs and turtles, the movement of the moon, the movement of the sun, the trees growing, the plants growing, the animals coming to the river. So that would be when the water was up, right? So this is a calendar to show when to start irrigating your crops. The Sumerian calendar was developed out of a necessity to control water during the rainy months. The Euphrates and the Tigris would flood in February and March. Sumerians were the first to develop a canal system to water crops. This required complete unity between farmers and could only be accomplished by developing a written calendar for everyone to use as a guide. Now Sumerians weren't following Yahweh, right? They were following all kinds of false gods. When we went into Samaria, we were told to tear down their idols and all that kind of stuff. So we know that they weren't following Yahweh. If we would just rely on Yahweh, we wouldn't have to worry about any of this man's calculation, would we? It's not something that we would even have in the back of our mind. The Egyptian calendar. I'm trying to move through this pretty fast. I know it's boring. I know it's minutiae. It's not my normal teaching. It's not what I normally do. Normally I'm Torah, and that's all I'm going to talk about. But we need to get through this before we can get to Torah. The ancient Egyptian calendar was a civil calendar. The calendar was a solar-based calendar with 365-day year. The year consisted of 3 seasons of 120 days each, plus an additional month of 5 extra days that were treated as outside of the year proper. Okay, so they basically had the same calendar as the Samaritans did, but every year they would have an additional month of 5 days. It's basically the same thing we do now with an additional day every 4 years. We call it a leap year on the Gregorian calendar. But they all recognized they had a problem. So when they recognized the problem, they tried to correct the problem. But they tried to correct the problem by using man's calculations. Instead of returning to the Father and keeping His calendar, they always tried to correct it with their own understanding. What Scripture say about leaning on our own understanding? We're not supposed to do that, are we? Okay. So each year consisted of 3... Oh, I already read that. Each season was divided into 4 months of 30 days. These 12 months were initially numbered within each season, but came to also be known by the names of their principal festivals. So in ancient Egypt, if you were celebrating the god of Ra, anybody heard about the sun god Ra? Well, anybody, if he is the sun god, guess what season they would be celebrating Ra? The summer months, right? Because it's hottest. It's when we have the most daylight. So though that season would have been called the season of Ra. We can take that and correlate it back to the plagues and all that kind of stuff. It's really cool teaching when you do that kind of stuff. It's all there if we just read the Torah. Each month was divided into 3 10-day periods known as decans or decades. Now we know a decade is what? 10 years, right? But they divided a decade into 10 days. How many, since you've come into the Messianic movement, has heard, well, at one point we were on a 10-day calendar? They're not lying when they tell you that, because at one point we were slaves in Egypt and we were made to follow a 10-day calendar. So they're not lying when they say that, but they're trying to make up their own calculations using the same thing these people used, their own understanding, instead of returning to Yahweh and seeing what He said about it. Because this calendrical year was nearly a quarter of a day shorter than the solar year, the Egyptian calendar lost about 1 day every 4 years relative to the Gregorian calendar. It is therefore sometimes referred to as the wandering year, Latin annus vagus, as its months rotated about 1 day through the solar year every 4 years. Now let's stop there and talk about that. Everybody knows a little bit of Greek. You might not realize you know Greek, but you do. We've talked about it before. If I say geology, geo, earth, ology, the study of. If I say astronomy, astro, stars, onomy, the study of. Okay, so everybody knows a little Greek, even though you don't realize you know a little Greek, because Greek has infiltrated our society. So when we look at this wandering year, we need to understand that the months of the year became named during this time period. So anybody know what the Greek word deca means? December, right? Or sorry, 10. Deca means 10. It's where our month December was. What month is December now? 12. September. What month should that be?
6.
7, right? September. October. Oc. How many legs does an octopus have? 8. Octa, or the octagon. The same way we get the word penta. 5. Pentagon. Pentagon has 5 sides, right? Octagon has 8 sides. So when we start realizing that, why is Deca now the 12th month? Octa is now the 10th month. The whole calendar has slid 2 months' time, right? That's what happened when, we're going to get into it a little bit deeper when we, probably next week, when we start talking about the Gregorian calendar. Pope Gregory decided he needed to correct the calendar. But he left the months fixed in their place that they were at that time. He just reset the calendar and added in what we call the leap year. Okay, from the Julian calendar. We'll get into all that mess a little bit later. So the months were still slid off. Everybody knows that the first 4 months of the year were named after gods, right? Janus. I mean, we're not going to go into all that though. So, just minutiae that we don't need. We're just trying to find out the historical value of how calendars originated. The civil calendar ran concurrently with the Egyptian lunar calendar. What? Egypt had 2 calendars at that time. Why would Egypt, who was focused on the worship of Ra, now start focusing on the moon? Maybe because they took a whole people in as slaves, right? That they saw their crops flourishing, that they saw everything that was happening, how the Father was blessing them. Then they started relying on the moon, so they had their civil calendar, and they're like, okay, our civil calendar isn't quite working for us planting our crops. So what if we look at these Israelites and go off the calendar that they're going off of, which was based in what? A lunar calendar, right? Or so they thought. It's more than a lunar calendar. Egyptian lunar calendar, which was used for some religious rituals and festivals. Some Egyptologists have described it as a lunar solar, with an intercalary month supposedly added every 2 or 3 years to maintain its consistency with the solar year, but no evidence of such calculation before the 4th century BC has yet been discovered. The 4th century BC, what was going on around the 4th century BC?
We were making bricks.
Huh?
We were making bricks.
We were making bricks, exactly right. So we were slaves in the land of Egypt. That's why they can't find anything previous to that. Because we were slaves in Egypt at that time, and they drew their calendar from us. So when we begin to look at this, we begin to discover some things. As much as they're trying to keep Egypt, how many knows that most of the scientific world says Jews were never slaves in Egypt? Did you not know that? There's a big dispute that Jews were never slaves in Egypt. We just made that up so we could steal your gold and drain the blood of your Christian children and make matzah out of it. I mean, that's the stories that were told on us. We've just invented all this stuff. But yet their own calendars, even their own reckoning of time, proves the events of the Bible. Without the Bible there, right? This is a picture of the Egyptian calendar. See over here, where you have a half moon? Over here they're looking at the sun. I don't read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, but I can understand what a circle represents. So, all that means something. Doesn't mean something to me, but I just wanted you to see that that's the calendar that Egyptians were going off of during that day and time. Now we look at the Assyrian calendar. This is one of the other societies that were basically going off that same model of a calendar, that Sumerian calendar. So the Assyrian calendar is a solar calendar used by modern Assyrian people. They're still on it today. Okay, because Assyrians are still here today, right? So they're still going off the same calendar that they've had for century after century after century. I mean, sure, most of them are on the Gregorian calendar as well, but when they look at themselves as a people, they go off of their own calendar. The year begins with the first sight of spring. What calendar goes off the first sighting of spring? The biblical calendar, right? Anybody remember when Esther and Nehemiah was taken captive into where? Syria, right? In Assyria, right? So now Assyria starts realizing that there's a calendar. There's some way that we can calculate when to put our seeds in the ground, when to harvest our crops, what time of the year our festivals are, because Yahweh appointed these times. It says it clearly, they are His appointed times. 4750 BC was set as its first year in the 1950s, based on a series of articles published in the Assyrian national magazine, Gilgamesh. Okay? Write that word down, Gilgamesh, if you really want to study this out. And then go research Gilgamesh. You're going to find out a whole lot of stuff concerning the Assyrians and the Assyrian calendar. As stating that the cuneiform tablet dating 4750 BC mentioned the year of the coming of the great flood and beginning of life. Anybody remember a great flood? And the beginning of life? Because life began again with what? Noah and the flood. So here we have the Assyrian calendar basically saying the exact same thing as the Bible, even though they don't claim to follow the Elohim of the Bible. I'm going to show you something really cool here in just a minute, because believe it or not, we're going to turn this back around where we can get into a little bit of scripture. This is a copy of the Assyrian calendar. What does that look like? It kind of looks like the same thing we saw in the Sumerian calendar, right? A disc that they could sit out there and rotate and calculate the movement of the stars in the heavens, right? Remember, they didn't have all this light distortion back then. When it was nighttime, you could see the heavens clearly. Anybody been out away from town on a hilltop somewhere where there's no light and able to look at the stars? Whole different scene than it is in town, isn't it? Now, the Elam. If you were a part of Elam, you were an Elamite, right? So the Elamite calendar. The earliest information about an Elamite calendar comes from Akkadian tablets dealing with juridical, somebody say that, matters discovered at Susa. Anybody remember a book that talked about Susa? The book of Esther, right? Okay, so we see Susa mentioned in the book of Esther. What I want you to understand is the Elamite calendar and the Babylonian calendar, which is going to be our last calendar for today, are basically the same calendar. Babylonian calendar, Elamite calendar. I already read it. Discovered at Susa and belonging to the old Elamite kingdom from the 19th to the 16th century BC. In fact, Elam was ruled by a steady Elamite dynasty, whose kings bear Elamite names. Genesis 10:22. And the children of Shem. Who was Shem's firstborn son? Who was Shem's firstborn son? Elam. So that's where the land of Elam came from. That's where the Elamites come from. Okay? So all of this stuff is important reference material. When you start reading Scripture, that's the reason the Father puts the names of all these children. They did nothing. You ever read anything else about Elam through the whole of Scripture? No. So why did the Father put that in there? So we can look back through history and find these figures. We can find these places. We can find the movement of these tribes as they moved across the earth. So the children of Shem, Elam and Asher and Araphax and Lud and Aram. The Babylonian calendar. The Babylonian calendar was a lunar solar calendar which years consisting of 12 lunar months, each beginning with a new crescent moon, was first sighted low in the western horizon at sunset, plus an intercalary month inserted